Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today, here with a new spicy deck profile. This time, I will be showing off the Water Nature Aggro deck that actually myself and my brother Gareth both decided to bring to the most recent Kaijudo Open tournament that I was hosting, the one that I announced just a while back on the channel. So we both decided to go for Water Nature Aggro, which is a deck I guess I've been working on for a little while in a bunch of different variations. It's been something I've had kind of on the back burner, put a little bit more time into it leading up to the tournament, and Gareth and I kind of went back and forth on a few card choices, and I was definitely trying to sell Gareth on trying it out, and along the way I decided to try it out myself as well, and then get two people, see how the deck performs. So that tournament's currently ongoing while I'm going through this deck, but both of us doing decently well so far, so we'll see how it turns out. But yeah, I guess it wouldn't be a Modest Duelist video without a little bit more preamble. So I guess I want to talk a little bit how I kind of came to this sort of approach to the deck. I guess the original builds of this deck were something I think I even shared it on the channel quite a while ago in one of my videos, where I had a Water Dark Nature Squillis deck, which was playing a very similar kind of core to this deck of just the Water Nature good aggro stuff. Rusalka's, Finbar, Broodmother, Anjak, Cephalia, those kinds of cards. That was a big part of that deck. And then I was coupling those cards at the time with a Corrupted package, or I guess a Wild Veggie package, whatever you want to think about it. And that was like Pesky Pineapple, Renegade, and Bad Apple as kind of like a mana generating engine. And then I was leveraging that to generate a bunch of mana and convert that into something like a Squillis Scourge at the time, which was like a big payoff card. So you would just couple this like good stuff aggro deck, use some medium kind of like corrupted stuff to maybe high roll and generate a bunch of advantage, and then use that payoff card with Squillis, and that could give you some big staying power against other decks. So that was kind of one of the original builds, and I think that deck still has a lot of merit. I think it's got its own strengths and weaknesses. I think it just has like a kind of inherent clunkiness to it, and then can be a little bit slow, quick, a little bit awkward, especially with like the builds I had. I just ran into some issues with it, but again, I still think it's a pretty solid deck. Maybe it has more of a home in like the standard format, for example, but I ended up kind of moving away from the Corrupted package, basically moving away from Bad Apple, I guess, not wanting to have like a more kind of inconsistent card like that. And but what I really did like was the early game package of just Pesky Pineapple, Bronze Arm, Renegade. Like just having those cheap 2-mana creatures that die, and when they die they go to mana, and that just lets you maintain like advantage while you're pushing in on your opponent, because they have to answer those cards. If they trade off, that's really good for you. Even if they attack over it, that can be fine for you at times. It just lets you push damage, and like worst case you just end up with sprouts that got in like a little bit of damage early, which is nice, and then you can take advantage of the bodies in a bunch of different other ways. And I just found like they were really nice cards to attack, especially like mid-range decks, for example. Like just those low investment early drop creatures were really nice, because if you just play like random other 2-drops and they kill them, then you just get stranded on low resources and can't really do anything after that. But building a deck that could really take advantage of that mana was one of the ideas. And I guess the second idea that kind of coupled that was just these refill cards. Like I was playing like 3 Broodmother in the Water Dark Nature deck, and maybe like a Cephalia, maybe one. And I really decided like I wanted to push really hard on that and play like the full 6, and then just be a super like dump your hand early on these dies, goes to mana creatures and other stuff like that. And then if they kill them, it's even better for you because you get in aggressive for early damage. And then if they have to like attacking with one of those on turn 3, on turn 4, or if they kill it, then on turn 4 you're untapping on 5 mana, and now you can drop a Cephalia and completely refill. And it just felt really cohesive, where you take advantage of that early aggression, you take advantage of the extra resource, because those die when those creatures die, you end up with mana ramp, and you just want, how do you take advantage of that? Draw a bunch of cards and play a bunch more cheap stuff. So that was kind of the direction I decided to go, and that's kind of how things developed. I moved away from the kind of like slow, clunky ramp into like Squillis payoff. So moved away from the clunky, corrupted, veggie specific stuff, moved away from the Squillish splash package, and then just over time the deck got leaner and leaner. So I was playing like the full 9 of these Dies Ghost of Mana cards at first to really push on that axis. I think Renegade, Pineapple, and Manapod. So I was really pushing hard on that. Jarbala Hatchery was another, I should mention right away, that's like another super key card for this deck, just letting you dump your hand super effectively with all these 2-drops. Lets you really go wide, and with Cephalia and Broodmother, that card is exceptionally nuts. Like, it's just crazy. So, yeah, and over time, again, like I said, the deck got kind of refined and leaner and more aggressive. I think a big shift as well, playing certain matchups, was I decided to add Charging Great Claws and move a little bit more. At first, it was like with the old deck, it was just playing some Anjax as like a mid-rangey value card, and adding the Charging Great Claw for the more aggressive option was a big deal. And then I think the other big thing was hammering out the extra 2-drop slots. So I ended up moving away from the full 9 Dies Ghost of Mana cards, and I decided to start putting in stuff like Many Tribes and Drifting Toadstool, which really works well with the hatcheries and the Cephalias and all that stuff. So yeah, the deck got more refined over time and moved away from that kind of clunky starting place. And now they end up as like 2 completely different decks, but I definitely kind of evolved how I was building. It all sort of stemmed from the same thing. Like, I remember way back testing with Andros, so the Water Dark Nature deck, and being a little disillusioned with it, and making a bunch of changes, and then made a bunch of changes from that, and then eventually got to this kind of place, which is really nice. And yeah, I guess the place it is now, I should also mention, is very similar to my Mono Nature list actually too. The 2 decks just play fairly differently. I think it's basically has a 12-card water package, so it ends up being around 22 to 25 cards that are the same as my Mono Nature list, depending on whether or not I'm playing like an extra set of 2-drops or not. So basically, but it's at least like 50%, probably more, of the same cards, right? Which is pretty telling of how good the nature package is, I guess. But yeah, I think the main difference is it just plays very differently than Mono Nature, where Mono Nature has a very prominent Boulder Fist game plan, and then you're just building like more individual threats like Roll Core and challenging the board more in that way with just those big threats, countering what your opponent's doing perhaps, and getting extra resources that way. This deck is a lot more of just a swarm deck, playing way more 2-drops. You're really planning on dumping your hand, going wide, and then playing these draw cards, and then using those draw cards to just keep going wide, or rebuild if your opponent answered your board. And then just like digging into your evolutions is basically just reach cards. Like in Mono Nature, they're a lot more about just like answering your opponent, having the biggest thing around, setting up and digging for Boulder Fist. This deck is much more about just swarming and then using an Anjac or Charging Great Claw as like the fast attack kind of speed attacker thingy that comes down and kills your opponent. So yeah, but the deck, really fun to play, and there's lots of really cool lines with it in the early game, like lots of kind of nut draws that are really amazing, which I'll go over in the profile. But that should probably do it for the preamble, and I guess we'll head right into the deck profile, zoom in, bring the camera down and whatnot. But yeah. All right, so to kick off the list, you start with the package that I touched on of the 6 right now. When they die, they go to mana creatures. We got 3 Pesky Pineapple, 3 Manapod Beetle. They just give you a really nice aggressive early game core where you can just push for early damage. You don't have to worry super hard about getting blown out by shield blasts in the first few shields, because you're always maintaining advantage, having those cards go back to your mana zone, so you can leverage those really well with the extra mana in this deck, where you just use that to swarm when you draw all these extra cards via Finbar, Cephalia, and Broodmother. So they're just kind of low investment early game cards that let you maintain a high level of resource, which is really nice. They are very small, which can be a problem for this deck. You just kind of suck battling for board position. Bronze Arm Renegade is definitely an option. A lot of my builds used to play 9 of these, just 3 Renegade, 3 Pineapple, 3 Manapod, and I was just full on that plan. And then I eventually found some different 2-drops I liked more, but I was usually just playing like Mana Pod and Renegade, and then I kind of decided to cut the Renegade just because I found that card to be a little bit more demanding. The fact that it requires you to have a water card to be able to play it on turn 2, that there's just flexibility there, where sometimes, I mean, your Rusalkas, your Cephalias, all your water cards, basically your Finbars too, they're really important cards a lot of the time, and being forced to charge one to make a turn 2 play was kind of annoying. Like, there's just less flexibility, but the body is definitely not trivial. Like, having 2k does matter, but I don't know, just the inflexibility coupled with being a multi-civ, I think getting to 0 multis for this deck was really nice. Just super smooth. You have a bunch of mana ramp cards where it's really nice to make sure that you have an untapped mana off of that with like Chief Many Tribes and such. So yeah, these cards, they just play into the game plan of the deck really well and let you swarm, invest into your board presence without having to worry about like losing a bunch of cards. If you get hit with like an early Arbiter, you can still play through it pretty easily, because it makes trading, like when you have so many powerful 5-drops, attacking with one of these on turn 3 is really scary for your opponent, because like even if you get that extra shield, you get that first shield, get a little bit of damage, and even if they have the creature to attack over it, that can put you up to 5 cards or 5 mana the next turn, and then you can drop a Broodmother Cephalia. So just turning it into like even just a sprout that deals a little bit of damage can be really nice. So keep continuing with like the early drops. We have kind of the 2 sets of 2-drops that really make the deck what it is, I think. Chief Many Tribes is something I kind of came to. Just pairs so well with, I guess, like the other most important card in this deck is Jarvala Hatchery. Just the whole early game revolves around Hatchery, and it's just such a crucial card. Just giving you the ability to swarm, dump out a bunch of 2-drops, and then it just lets you play with extra mana every turn, right? You can go 2-drop Hatchery turn 2 or turn 3, and then play Many Tribes, and then you just go up to 4 mana on turn 3. You have 3 dudes in play, and then, I mean, you're not, and it's not just like going all in either. Like Many Tribes, it's a +1 card, right? If they kill your mana pod, that goes to mana. Jarvala Hatchery, virtual card advantage, because next turn you're untapping with effectively like 2 extra lands as long as you have the cards to support it. So it's just crazy. And then so your Hatchery Many Tribes draws are some of the best that you can do, especially like going first. I mean, like obviously the nut draw hand is just like 2, 3, 2, and then play like a Cephalia on turn 4, and then you can even like chip for damage the turn before, because once you're at 4 mana anyways, it doesn't even matter if they kill your board necessarily. You just like poke for the damage with the Mana Pod Beetle. They have a handful of cards. The next turn you can drop Cephalia. If the Hatchery stuck around, you can even play another 2-drop off of the Cephalia after you draw, which is just gets really crazy, and then you just swarm them really fast. And that's what this deck does so well, is just swarm, gets way out ahead on board presence, and then it also gets ahead on mana because you're playing with Hatchery, Many Tribes, these beetle creatures as well. So usually you have a board advantage and a mana advantage, and then Cephalia just gives you the card advantage as well. So, and even if it's just like Broodmother or something, even if you're not like beating your opponent on full cards, you're at the very least you have a ton of cards to play with, and like even if you're breaking shields, they're probably going to have more cards than you a decent amount of the time. But what this deck really does so well is that you just have way more virtual advantage, I want to say, like card activity, however you want to describe it. Like the fact is your opponent can have more cards than you, but their ability to play all those cards is not going to be as good as yours. Like this deck plays with a ton of cards and a lot of cheap cards too. So like you have 5 cards in hand, you can dump those all out of your hand within like 2 turns and just completely overwhelm them on board presence. And then oftentimes you can even just refill with another copy of Broodmother Cephalia because they chain into each other. It just gets crazy. Whereas your opponent can have a hand of 5 cards, but like a bunch of them are 6-drops and 5-drops, and they can only play 1 card a turn, and their card advantage more translates to having like 1 good play a turn, right? Because if you have 5 cards in your hand, chances are you have like 5 flexible options, and then you get to pick the best option, right? So you play 1 really powerful card every turn, because your card advantage is more about having options, whereas this deck, you play a lot of weaker cards, but your card advantage is more translated into just making way more plays, basically getting ahead on tempo is like what this deck just does. But just it plays with so many cards, you can even if you're not beating them on card advantage, you have enough to like keep being aggressive, keep pushing through. So this whole early game package plus these refill cards just makes the deck function, just swarms like crazy, generates so much advantage. And like I said, hatchery, many tribes are some of the best draws in the deck. But even if you don't have those, Toadstool was like it was kind of the last 2-drop I found, because I mean a lot of this deck, it overlaps with Mono Nature. I think 22 to 25 of the cards in this deck I think are played in my current Mono Nature list. I'm always kind of messing around with that list as well, but basically Toadstool was a card I figured out was like probably the 2-drop that I was missing. I was always debating like, do I want like Jackalax or Pouncing Cricket, Manapod Beetle? Which 2-drop did I want in Mono Nature? Savage Spawn is another option. And I kind of realized like Toadstool was probably the one. Like it just gives you a lot of flexibility, helps ease the game for you when you go second, just gives you so many nice curves. And in this deck in particular, it's really strong for making up for the hands where you don't have hatchery. Like it can feel a little awkward when you do have hatchery because you get in weird spots where you play this, you don't use the effect, it feels bad, like it's just a 2-mana 1k. Oftentimes you feel at odds because hatchery wants you to keep cards in your hand so you can use its effect to generate that mana, but Toadstool, so the Toadstool effect kind of becomes useless when you draw them together, but obviously still it's a 2-drop that lets you set up for many tribes if you have that kind of hand. But the big deal, like I said, is just setting up for lots of plays where you can set up for a lot of broken setup, or not broken setups. You can have a lot of hatchery-esque hands with Toadstool that don't require you to have the hatchery. So like even just as simple as like using it as a kind of sprout effect, you get back the cards with Cephalia most of the time, or Broodmother just like gives you the advantage back. So it just gets you ahead so you can drop these cards on turn 4, which is just good enough. There's also a lot of setups, like especially going second. One of the things you can do is, again, if this card is in place of hatchery, if you just have something like this, a combination of these 3 cards, I mean on turn 2 you can play this, or sorry, on turn 2 you can play Manapod Beetle, then turn 3 you can go Toadstool and then many tribes. So you, once again, this puts you up to, I believe, 5 mana on turn 3. So you, on turn 4, you're untapping with 5 mana, and if you do it on the play, you're top decking, which is why it's not as good, because usually, but on the draw it's really effective because you can hold 1 remaining card, and often that card will be something like a Finbar, a Cephalia, or a Broodmother, which is very nice obviously because you can just dump your hand, right? And then you're untapping with 5 mana and a card on hand when you're going second. And if that card is Finbar, you can just charge your top deck, play Finbar, and now you have 4 bodies on turn 4. You have 4 creatures in play, you bounce their thing back, and you're attacking with 3 dudes. So like hands like that can be really nice. Obviously if it's Master Trader, you just, gas back up. There's just a lot of options. So like Toadstool just gives you really nice draws that make up for hatchery. And what else it can do, obviously it plays well with Charging Greatclaw, just setting up for that. Now those hands can be a little bit linear. It depends on the matchup whether that's good or not, I think. So yeah, that draw, it doesn't always work because it's pretty linear. You kind of invest a lot of resources or you kind of sacrifice a lot of tempo, I guess, in the sense that you go all in on one tall threat, and very often you can get blown out, especially in certain matchups if you just go in on a Greatclaw. Especially in like aggressive matchups, for example, you run the risk of like going all in on like one Greatclaw, then they just like do something, and then you can have the plan of playing Master Trader, but then you're just like, if they just bounce the Greatclaw the turn before, then when you refill with Master Trader, like you draw a bunch of cards, but because the deck has low defense, like often they can just put you on the back foot, and even though you have a bunch of cards, they can just kind of beat you down with a lot of small creatures if you let them. That line doesn't always work, I feel like, especially if your opponent's heavy on Shield Blast creatures, they just really flip the corner. So it's kind of a matchup dependent situation, and it's really effective like at combating attacking creatures, like something like a Swordhorn that might have just swung at you or something like that, although obviously that doesn't necessarily work on curve all the time. So yeah, whatever, but it is an option in certain matchups for sure. So yeah, that's kind of the Toadstool was a big part of making the deck function in a lot of ways by just, yeah, again, just kind of functioning as like another hatchery. I think there are definitely arguments for playing more early game stuff. I mean, it's just like the 3 hatcheries and then 12 2-drops. So you kind of want a little bit more, I would say, but it's hard to really fit. I think it's just hard to find space. And the Toadstool, that's like the second strength of Toadstool, where it kind of gives you a lot more early game stuff. Just by way of like turning your 4-drops into 3-drops in a lot of hands it just really helps, because again, like you kind of want a little bit more early game stuff, but like I don't really want to play all these like kind of clunky 3-drops like Tricky Turnip or other things you could think of, Sunclan Tortoise, maybe water creatures like, I don't know, Coral, or seems random, but yeah, like the main thing is like Toadstool. Just, I mean, when you play like the Rusalka Brigade, you've got obviously the Charging Great Claw, which is kind of high variance, but an option as well, and then you have like the 6 Rusalkas in this list right now. Turning those into 3-drops just gives you a lot of play that you might not otherwise have. So I think that's like why Toadstool is just really strong and really important for this deck. But yeah, I mean, you could definitely consider playing more early game stuff. Like I think Prickleback is an option. Playing the Renegades or Cyber Scamps or something like that, like another set of 2-drops, could be nice as well. But right now, I have the 6 Rusalkas. These are probably some of the flex slots. Again, could turn into early game or could turn into more Shield Blast. I'm not really sure which one. I think in testing for the event, I don't know, Gareth and I talked about it for a bit and kind of decided to just go with Rusalka because, I mean, it's just good against a lot of the aggro matchups anyway. It's just a great, like both of these Rusalkas, they're just great. So trimming on them, they're just more flexible than Shield Blasts, but Shield Blasts have their merit, definitely. One of the things this deck can do, I mean, you have such a good card advantage game that like if you're playing against mid-range decks and stuff like that, or even like control decks, it can be hard for them to like truly stabilize. At least like when you're playing against Andromeda control decks with like blockers and Shield Blasts and Havens and all that sort of stuff, like they can stabilize and your cards don't matter anymore a lot of the time. Or like an Infernus Awakened deck, for example, if they land Infernus, they'll just lock you out. So like those things, obviously, if they stabilize, they're gonna beat you, right? But a lot of the other mid-rangey controls, the lower tiered ones, it's really hard for them to actually truly stabilize against you because you just have so many good card advantage cards. You have stuff like Anjak that's really hard to answer. Like you have just a really good grind game, I think, a lot of the time. And very often you put your opponent in positions where they might just have to like take aggressive lines to try to close the game quickly rather than trying to like just completely lock you out like other Andromeda controls would do, where they stabilize and they have like you blink and they have like 7 shields out and you're just top deck, like it's just, you have no chance, right? You can't break through Havens. Like they just effectively lock you out. They're a prison deck almost, and then you just lose somehow eventually if they decide to attack, if they feel like having fun doing that. But most of the time they probably don't. They'll just like, they could deck you out if they wanted to every time. But yeah, so that's what kind of what I was thinking with this deck is like the Shield Blasts have extra merit because against those kinds of mid-rangey decks, you can put them in spots where, again, they can't really effectively stabilize you or guarantee stabilize against you. So at some point they're going to have to take a risky line and try to just like build up enough of a board to go for those like kind of two-turn lethal setups or something like that, or maybe go for something cheesy like that, because again, they give you too much time, you'll just like find a Cephalia, draw a bunch of cards, find a Finbar, kind of break up their board position. Like there's all sorts of stuff you can do. So you just put them on the back foot, they're low on shields, and then they have to maybe try to take the game from you with an aggressive line. And then so you force them into doing that, and then that's where you can really punish them with Shield Blast, right? Because it's kind of almost like built into the plan of the deck where you beat them on all these other axes, they're forced to take like a cheesy line, and then they'll just get blown out by Shield Blast. So making sure you have enough Shield Blast to consistently punish them when they have to take those lines could be important. But the problem is like there's not too many quality Shield Blasts to play in this deck. And I don't know, we felt like the Rusalkas were just better, more consistent cards. Like they're really good from hand in a ton of matchups. Again, with like the Toadstool and other stuff, they help you increase your effective early game card counts. Like they're just really great. Like they're good against aggro, just like Shield Blasts are, basically. And they're also very good against like certain kind of mid-range and control decks. So we felt like just maxing out on these. But I could definitely see an argument for going to more Shield Blasts. But yeah, it just, again, the Shield Blast felt pretty underwhelming, but it does also feel like we don't have enough. And then there's the whole kind of thing where when we're only playing a deck of 3 Shield Blasts, right? We just have the 3 Artichokes, so we're really cutting it slim on those. And the thing is, like, having more good cards from hand, like, we already have a ton of good cards from hand, so, like, improving our shield zone, we probably get more out of that than just adding more quality castable cards. So you could definitely make an argument for that. And I think Cryo Nucleus would be the option. It's kind of mediocre, but it helps the mana base probably the most. It's probably, I felt like it was in testing the best water Shield Blast that we could play. And it was also really reasonable from hand, because again, you do generate a lot of mana, and it's just it turns into a really inefficient version of Psychic Predator. But even like a 6 mana 1 turn freeze out of hand can be decent. So it was a pretty solidly performing card for me, but we decided to go with the 6 Ursalkas instead. And then, like I touched on, we got the Artichokes. It's just a nice card. It's just one of the more powerful, flexible Shield Blasts. Big body in the early game especially. Just one of the things this deck can struggle with is like swarming small creatures, and then because our small creatures are the smallest usually, so if even just like 1500s and 2Ks, this can be really annoying if your opponent goes wide with those, and then you're kind of out of luck unless you have an Artichoke often, because you're not really good at answering multiple cards in the same turn until you really have like your engine going. So Artichoke was just like the biggest blowout that we could play, I think. So we went with this one. But yeah, I mean, there are other ideas, like you could splash some better Shield Blasts like Stormspark and Arbiter, but I don't really think it's worth doing that, because a lot of your opening hands are really intensive on wanting nature cards, because like if you open a hand with Hatchery, Many Tribes, Mana Pod, you want a 4th nature card so you can cast all these, right? And like all your basically all your cards are so good, you want, I don't know, you don't want to be ruining your mana base like that, just because it just makes your hands worse usually, and like it gives you just less flexibility. And this deck is all about like having a bunch of options for your opening lines and broken starts, and making that less consistent I don't think is worth it. So yeah, then we have all the refill cards, like I've mentioned a ton, and really like the big conception point for this deck was just maximizing all of these cards. So triple Cephalia, triple Broodmother, just really great cards. Broodmother, really important in a lot of matchups because 4K can be big, Protector can be big, but Cephalia just draws like 5-6 cards very often, so they're both really, really strong in their own right. Talked a lot about those so far. Then we have the other kind of refill card is General Finbar, obviously just one of the most powerful cards in the game. Just interaction, really rewards you for swarming the board, which is what this deck does. So yeah, just an excellent card. Not much to say about it beyond that, really. And then the last cards we have are the Evo Suite. So we have, as I talked about, we've got triple Charging Greatclaw. Just a really great, cheap, aggressive evolution card. Lets you go for damage. I mean, it's really cheap with Hatchery in play. Like, it's really easy to line up. Just a very strong card. Has some matchups where it's not that good, but obviously a lot of matchups where it's excellent. So playing that, and then we're playing Anjak, one of my favorite cards. Just such a sticky threat, very difficult to answer. You have lots of nice cards to bring out of your mana zone. Just very excellent. Big beat stick. So playing that. And the last card was the we had a 1-of slot, and we were debating kind of, Gareth and I were talking like, do we want a Shield Blast? Do we want like one random other early game card? And then I also tested like a bunch of different 1-of evolutions, but the card we decided on was just the 1-of Boulder Fist, which felt pretty, feels like just pretty blatant in hindsight. Like, it's just a really nice card for, I mean, it just gives you a lot of options. It's just like a 1-card game plan. So if you open this card in your opening hand, you can play with that in mind and just play towards this in a lot of matchups. You could definitely see arguing for 2 copies, although like compared to Mono Nature, this deck plays a lot different. Like, it's more of a swarm deck and you're attacking a lot more. It's less about just like kind of sitting back and boulder fisting, but the fist gives you that kind of option. So it's really nice to draw into, and you have a lot of card draw, you see a lot of things. So there's a good chance you find it at some point in certain matchups, and it's really nice when you do, but you don't need it. But it was just like an option, like rather than playing like one extra early game card or like one extra shield blast, I felt like this card gave you a lot of impact out of one card slot, because again, it's like a one card game plan. You don't want to draw too many of it because it's kind of clunky, not at its best in this deck. Like, you don't have you're not like a great Boulder Fist deck again. Like, you have like the Anjak, the Charging Great Claw, and Broodmother, but those aren't always lying around. So a lot of the time it's kind of situational, but it just gives you something to play towards that's really effective. And yeah, if it's felt really good in the deck. Could definitely argue for like maybe a second copy, but I don't know. It's really nice to have the one of, I think. But yeah, cards have been really good so far. And yeah, because I mean, one of the problems with this deck is like you have a lot of beat sticks and weenie creatures, and you go wide, but sometimes like your interaction is like one-off like removal cards like the Rusalkas and Finbar, and like yeah, you can draw a bunch of cards and like play 2 of these in one turn very often, but not always, right? And that not something you can really rely on. And against like decks that build up pretty strong boards and then just kind of wall you out, it's really nice to have access to a card like Boulder Fist at some point. It just gives you that card to play towards sometimes. And again, when it's in your opening hand, you don't have to play things as aggressive. You can kind of wall up and do that. So yeah, really nice. Solves a few issues, just a really high impact one of. So that is the list. I guess I can quickly go over some of the options that we discussed. I mean, as I mentioned, there's the Shield Blast, what you want to play. There's like Veil Vortex, kind of medium. Ice Blades, cheap, which is kind of appealing for me, just when you draw a bunch of cards, just cheap interaction like that, but again, very underwhelming. Time Tethers, Gareth and I tried, and it just felt, I mean, it's one of those cards that I go back and forth on all the time. Like, sometimes I look at it at first and I was like, oh, this card's kind of trash. Then I think about it a bit and I'm like, I see a bunch of potential in it and I want to say it's like good, and then I loop back around to just thinking it's bad again. And I think ultimately, like most things, it's just kind of in between. Like, it's got its spots where it's nice, like stopping 2 attacks, using it proactively at certain points can be pretty effective too. But it's somewhat situational in that aspect. It's mainly just like a racing card. I don't know. It's kind of situational. It'd be kind of nice as a one of, I think. But yeah, it kind of underperformed, and it was like pretty. It was just kind of weird as like a defensive Shield Blast, because it doesn't really like remove things. Like, your opponent can go in and then like maybe they have some blockers up, for example, and like this isn't like an Arbiter kind of card where you can just like remove the blockers on their turn when they break this. Like, you can, all it does is freeze attackers basically. So as a Shield Blast, so it just felt, it kind of, yeah, it just pretty medium in performance. So like I said, I think Cryonucleus, just the highest upside, plays really well with the deck. Just another body, kind of like, it's like halfway between a Rusalka and one of these Shield Blasts. So pretty nice, flexible card. I would probably go with that if I added more Shield Blasts. Then we have a bunch of other options. I mean, there was early game stuff. I think Prickleback would maybe be my choice. Like, just the 1-drop gives you a lot of play with Hatchery, and kind of like it for like dragon matchup and stuff like that, just poking for shields, coming back to hand kind of safely. Just really cheap, lets you swarm, but kind of underwhelming card at the same time. There's Renegade is always like just going more into that plan, and stuff like Savage Spawn or any other 2-drop, there's merit to those. And then there's Cyber Scamp as well, which I think is a pretty good card. Not sure I would always, I mean, the reason I had it in the deck for sure before, and I moved away from it when I went to many tribes, but card is still pretty good. Like, it just, yeah, if your opponent like picks off your Cephalia and then you don't top deck well, then you can get up into some weird spots if they have like some stuff to wall you out as well. And I guess if they're walling you out, then Cyber Scamp's not always that good anyways. So I don't know, it just felt weird. Like, I felt like you generate enough good board presence and can top deck reasonably well that you don't necessarily need to like counter a bunch of stuff with Cyber Scamp, but the card is definitely good and can get you some free wins for sure. So what else? We got some 3-drop options. I mean, obviously you could entertain Tricky Turnip. I don't love the card. It just feels kind of slow, but it definitely has its merit. But this deck is less about like just landing evolutions all the time like Mono Nature, so I don't know. There's also some weird options like Coral to help with the blast situation, but I don't really think that was good. I experimented with it a tiny bit, but there's just no room for that. There's Also Orwellia, which is a card I've always wanted to find room for in these kinds of decks. And I think unfortunately there's still like not really room for it, but I definitely think this card has potential. It's just, I don't know. It just seems like it's at its best in a deck like this that swarms the opponent and just uses its cards more effectively than they do, but it's just, again, it's just kind of hard to find space. But I think it's something I've always, anytime I build a deck like this card's always in my like sideboard of options, but never makes a cut. But I should probably make a point of trying it a little bit more proactively. Some other cute stuff, Nurturing Hive. It's kind of like Drabella Hatchery, where it lets you go crazy with your Cephalias and Broodmothers, but I think it's mostly not win more, I guess. Like, it's powerful, but it's just inconsistent, just kind of an underwhelming card unless you're doing good stuff already for the most part. Yeah, just slow, like a 4-mana card that doesn't really affect the board that much the turn you play it, like unless you have like a handful already. And again, there's probably better stuff you can do, like just drop an evolution a little bit more simply. I don't think it's like that necessary, but it's kind of a cute card. And then kind of going along with that is another cute card is Cranky Leviathan. Like reusing certain Ender Battlefield effects really cheap with Hatchery, and if you're playing Hive too, it can be kind of crazy. Just like a cheap 4K in the early game is actually pretty impressive, and then you can just reuse like effects like Chief Many Tribes as well potentially. Like, but I think another just too cute card. And then some of the more legitimate options. I mean, Gigahorn Charger was a card. Definitely tried packages with this, especially like when I was trying more of the dark stuff, like Squilla Scourge and stuff like that. There was packages like that where I had like 3 Squillas and then Gigahorn Charger instead of Broodmother or something like along those lines, or playing this when I had more Boulder Fist as well, just playing that instead of Broodmother. But I just don't think it's good. Like Gareth and I both tried it. We both played versions of the deck that had Gigahorn Charger instead, and it just felt really mediocre. Like, yeah, it can search evolutions, but the problem is this card draws cards, but it only draws like other expensive cards, and it itself is an expensive card. So it's just kind of inflexible in that sense. Yeah, I don't know. It just didn't feel good. It's just not as good as Broodmother. And then we have like a whole suite of evolution options. We got Ancestor Bear, which I kind of like having like a random vortex sometimes, just swallow a bunch of small creatures that don't really matter, and then you get like a big powerful effect. And this card gives you a little bit of optionality from your mana zone, and also functions similar to Gigahorn Charger, or Charging Greatclaw, I should say. So this card is kind of fine, but don't love it. I tried it as a 1-of for a while. There's other options too, like a whole suite of 6 manas. I tried, or Rolkor is decent, like it finds you some just like a random body and then can dig for evolutions, but obviously you're not maximizing really either half of this card in this deck, but it's still a huge evolution. Then there's Mesa Behemoth, which gets you more of a search effect, like you can search for your Boulder Fist, but usually this card would be in place of Boulder Fist, I guess, but you can search good follow-up off this card. Kind of nice card. Maybe better than Rolkor for this deck, maybe not, I don't know. But that card felt decent. There was also Brissing Tatsurian, which is kind of a cute card. It can randomly be a triple breaker, which is pretty impressive. Can protect your stuff at points, like from dragons decks with Herald. Like if you're worried about Oathsworn Call shenanigans, like you can just attack with this. They have to attack it, but the problem is like they have Finbars and piercings for this card anyways, so it just feels not the best, but there are probably matchups where it's really nice. So it's a card I kind of like. Gives you another kind of uniquely powerful option like Boulder Fist, but cheaper card, but probably weaker overall. Again, there's more Boulder Fist that you could play. Calorith is an option as like another Anjak-esque card, especially if you're like playing more heavy on the water creatures, like if you have Renegade and you have Cyberscamp. But overall, I felt like this card was just not really that good. Yeah, it's just kind of slow. Like Anjak, the difference between this and Anjak, like they're both sticky creatures, I guess, but Anjak draws you like 0 mana cards when it dies, basically. Like it gives you free bodies. Whereas this card, it just generates like a copy of itself in the bait in your hand. So it draws cards when it dies effectively, but those cards cost mana. Anjak's cards don't cost mana. So there's a difference there. And then King Arboreus was another option. Definitely played this card a bit more, especially when you had like the multi-civ. There were a lot of times where I remember playing this card and drawing it, and it was like detrimental. Just being a Vortex just removes the flexibility so much already. Like there were just a lot of points where I had this in hand, and it was like it would be powerful when I resolved it, but the problem was like I would have to wait a turn to resolve it, and if I just had like a weaker evolution the turn before, then I would have just like won anyways. Like it was just like playing with fire in a sense, right? Like I could have just like played something random like Mesa Behemoth the turn before because I had just had one bait available, and then I would have won. But instead, because I only have one bait available, I can't play Arboreus, so I have to wait till next turn, and then if I'm lucky to get to that point, then I can land it and win the game, and because it's powerful enough to like make up that deficit. But yeah, it just felt like it was clunky and mostly just worse than other evolutions, although it does have optionality. Evolving on your water creatures can make use of like stuff like Rusalka that's just sitting in play, and again, like just getting rid of making use of some of those small bodies that might not matter can definitely be fun, but I didn't feel like the card was that good. So those are some options, and that's the deck. So we'll see how we do in the tournament. Gareth and I are both playing it again, so we'll definitely have to see how it works out. But I think it's been fun so far. Not the best deck by any means, but I don't know. As I play it more and more, I feel like a little bit worse about it. But yeah, the deck's pretty fun, pretty solid. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.